Chapter 39 Ash. After the war, the cremations. After the cremations, the remains given to the Ganga. It was there by the river, the last sift of ash and grit pouring from his fingers, that Yudhisthir fell into his depression. For 13 years his life had been directed to this moment, like an arrow released from the bow of a master archer. But when the arrow has shattered the target, what is left for it to do? Though we all entreated him, Yudhisthir would not leave the river bank and come to Hastinapur for his coronation. For weeks he sat staring at the devastated land where nothing would grow, thinking of the millions whose death anguish had poisoned the air. But most of all he brooded on Karna, his own brother whom he had hated for so long. I stayed with him during those weeks, for I was afraid to leave him alone. Each day we'd discuss the same things over and over, as though his mind were stuck in a rut too deep for it to climb out of. How delighted I was when he fell, Yudhisthir said. In my selfish glee, I ignored the fact that on that very day he had spared my life, and before that, the lives of Bhim, Nakul, and Sahadev. Why didn't I guess? Why didn't any of us guess? We rushed to view his corpse. We laughed and shouted our congratulations to Arjun, even though we knew he had killed him unfairly. Ah, the terrible sin of that fratricide will fall on me, not Arjun, for he only did what I wanted him to. My own regrets resurfaced as he spoke. If only I had told him what I knew earlier, how much heartache I could have prevented him now. But I couldn't afford to wallow in remorse. I needed to help Yudhisthir. In all our years of marriage, I had never seen him so dejected. No, not even when I was insulted in Duryodhan's court. I ignored the sting of that thought and said, "You acted from ignorance, not malice." But he refused to listen. He held me by the shoulders, his fingers digging into my flesh, his gaunt mouth working. How could my mother, so wise in everything else, have kept such a matter secret? How can I trust her again? There was a time when I'd have gained a certain pleasure from hearing him speak thus of the woman who, more than any of the other wives, had been my rival. But even the thought of such pettiness was distasteful to me now. A knot had unravelled in my heart when I saw Kunti at Karna's funeral. She looked so worn, so ashamed, so beaten down. Besides, guilt flooded me at Yudhishthir's words. I too had kept the same secret that his mother had. How furious might he be with me if he discovered this? I said, "It's not for you to judge your mother's actions. Who among us can know how terrified she must have felt when Karna was born? But Yudhisthir had sunk once again into grief and didn't hear me. Anxious at his continued apathy, my other husbands and I took him to visit Bhishma. Perhaps, we thought, a philosophical discussion with the grandfather would cheer him. We knew how Yudhisthir loved such things. The dying Bhishma put aside his own pains to teach him the art of kingship. A ruler should know how to conceal his own weakness. He should choose his servants carefully. He must cause dissensions among the noblemen in his enemy's kingdom. He should be forgiving, but not excessively so, for then men of evil heart would take advantage of him. His innermost thoughts must be concealed even from his nearest ones. Yudhisthir listened respectfully enough, but even Bhishma could not shake off his numb despair. Finally, Krishna took him to task. He pointed out that while Yudhisthir was indulging himself in melancholy, bandits were terrorizing his helpless subjects at the edges of the unraveling Kuru kingdom. Ah, Krishna! He had appealed to the one thing Yudhisthir couldn't shake off, his duty. He allowed himself to be led back to the city and crowned, though he took no pleasure in it. I didn't blame him. It was hard for anyone to find pleasure at Hastinapur. The palace, which in Duryodhan's day had been filled with a frantic, garish energy, had turned dank and funereal. The few retainers that were left, perhaps in deference to the old king and queen, were mourning and walked with a hushed step. I ordered them to dress in coronation clothing. They obeyed me fearfully, the festive attire hanging askew on their bodies. How I missed Dhaima then! Her raucous curses would have jolted them into action. I made my own servants pull down the heavy, dust-filled drapes and throw open the windows. I called my woman to comb out my long, tangled hair and rub perfume into it. Still, all around I smelled, inexplicably, funeral incense. As I breathed it, I felt as though I was sinking into the morass of depression that had claimed Yudhisthir. The night before the coronation, I stood at my window, unable to sleep. It saddened me to think that this was the place where I would be living out the rest of my life. What I had said to Bhishma a long time ago as a new bride still held true. It would never be home to me. On the day of the coronation, my greatest challenge was to enter the throne room again. At its threshold, my footsteps faltered, sweat sprouted in my armpits, my breath grew uneven. I had to use all my willpower to step into the room that had been the scene of my greatest humiliation. The task must have been harder still for my husbands. Their memories were worse than mine. To see a loved one in pain is more wrenching than to bear that pain yourself. The war had taught me this. However, we knew we had no choice. The throne of the Kurus had sat in the Sabha for generations. We couldn't move it, not at this time when we needed the help of tradition to stabilize a floundering kingdom. Once again, Krishna, who else, came to our rescue. From his own palace, he sent us cooks and gardeners, musicians and dancers, even his favorite elephant for Yudhisthir to ride in the royal procession. On coronation day, he brought the entire Yadu clan, and they, not knowing the doom that hung over them, cheered us with their simple pleasure in good food and fine wine, their feckless antics. Without them, we couldn't have borne the empty seats that stretched on both sides of the throne, seats that, out of respect or guilt, Yudhisthir would leave unfilled. On the right, Bhishma's, on the left, Drona's. In the raised alcove, the ornate throne specially carved for Duryodhan next to his, severe in its simplicity, the chair Karna had once used. Hastinapur after the war was largely a city of women, widows who had never dreamed that the survival of their families would depend on them. The poorer ones were used to working, but now that they were without male protection, they found themselves exploited. Affluent women, pampered and sheltered until now, were the easiest victims. Men would appear from nowhere, claiming to be relatives, and take control of the family fortunes. The women became unpaid servants. Sometimes they were turned out. They were too afraid, even if they had known how, to apply to the king for justice. I'd seen them on the roadside, often with children in their arms, begging. There were others that I didn't see, but I heard of the street corners they frequented at night, selling the only thing left to them. It was a terrible situation, and it saved me. I knew how it felt to be helpless and hopeless. Hadn't I been almost stripped of my clothing and my honor in this very city? Hadn't I been abducted in the forest and attacked in Virat's court when men thought I was without protection? Didn't I, even now, mourn my blood clan dead, every one of them? And if I wasn't careful, might I not turn into one of these women, empty-handed, capable only of churning through futile memories? It was time I shook off my self-pity and did something. I resolved to form a separate court, a place where women could speak their sorrows to other women. At an earlier, more arrogant time, I'd have tried to do it by myself, but now I asked Kunti and Gandhari for their aid. They acquiesced. Together we approached Yudhisthir. A chamber was set up in the woman's palace with thrones placed on the dais for the dowagers. Subhadra and I sat below. I invited Uttara too to help us. I had expected her to refuse, for she was in the late months of an unwieldy pregnancy, but to my surprise she agreed. Often she was the most perceptive one, seeing directly into the heart of a problem. Perhaps it was from these sessions that the unborn Pariksit, alert within his mother's womb, learned his judicial clarity, so that in time he would be compared to Rama, the most impartial of kings. Only Bhanumati declined to join us. She returned to her father's kingdom, and who could fault her? With the death of Duryodhan and Karna, said a voice in my head, what was left for her in this palace that had always made her feel like an outsider? On the day she left, as she climbed into her chariot, dressed in white, her forehead bare, her arms stripped of the jingling bangles she had once so delighted in, she raised her head for a moment to send me a look of smouldering hate. At that, guilt, never too far away, speared my heart. How the war had changed the naive girl she had been, eager to please, happy with the littlest things. For the sake of that girl and the man we had both loved silently, though perhaps in different ways, I prayed that she would find a measure of peace in the home of her childhood. The code by itself wasn't enough to help the woman. Yudhisthir had given us permission, but that was all he could afford to let us have. The coffers of Hastinapur had been depleted by the Great War, but unless we had the power to enforce our rulings, who would obey them? We were at a loss until Uttara came to us. It was just a few days before Pariksit's birth, followed by two maids carrying a chest. With a start, we recognized its ornate carvings. It contained her wedding jewelry. She threw open the lid and said, "I have no use for this anymore. Use it to help those who are more unfortunate than I." The sale of that jewelry allowed us to hire scribes to interpret the law and a queen's guard to carry out our judgments. By itself, it might not have been enough, but Uttara's action galvanized us all. We scrounged around, collecting our own jewelry and palace furnishings that weren't essential. Kunti surprised me by donating artifacts she had held on to all these years, things that had belonged to Pandu. All this allowed us to set up the destitute in homes of their own and buy merchandise to start businesses for them. In time, the women's market became a flourishing center of trade in the city, for the new proprietors took pride in their goods and were canny, but fair in their dealings. We trained those who showed interest in learning to become tutors for girls and young boys. And even in the later years of Parikshit's reign, when the world had passed into the fourth age of man, and Kali, the dark spirit, had gripped the world in his claws, Hastinapur remained one of the few cities where women could go about their daily lives without harassment.